there's at least a few questions. And
Hey, Carl, just because of the microphone situation, could you repeat whatever the question is before you answer
do
it?
you want me to, I mean, I usually walk around, but do you want me to stay up here? So are you still
If you don't mind, yeah, I figured it.
That's fine, okay. So don't be intimidated by the fact that I'm standing behind the podium. Yes, ma'am.
No, I wasn't. I was wondering.
Well, you know, like what we talked about earlier, you know, I know there's some folks who have more founding values, and they tend to coalesce in the Libertarian Party because they don't want to be part of the GOP, but because of our system, they kind of spin their wheels because they don't win elections.
Right.
So basically, from your email, the idea is to have plug into the system that already works and try and influence that system. Is that kind of?
Yeah, and you know, I think it's the convention process that we have even here in Texas is pretty amazing, and it's actually a lot more robust than it is in other states. But you know, I just think it's so remarkable that we have this whole infrastructure that's existed literally for hundreds of years, and it's so well developed. I mean, all these different practices, all these procedures and rules that go on to govern that process, it's a very well developed system. The only problem is, number one, people are not using that system to the best advantage and to our interests. They're not engaging in that system. And the other part of it is that system is not being used in the way that it was originally intended to be used, which is to nominate candidates. And so it's sort of a twofold thing. But I think part of what you were saying too is sort of the nature of the two-party system that we have in this country, and the challenge, you know, because we always hear about, well, we need to have a third-party candidate for president, or we need to have a third party to uproot one of the major parties. It's very interesting when you look at the history of our party system in this country, and a lot of times people invoke the analogy of the Republican Party overtaking the Whigs in the 1850s, and how, you know, maybe someday that's going to happen. I don't think it will happen. I mean, if you look historically, and I talk about this in the book, there was a period in the late 1880s and early 1890s when a lot of the election laws in this country changed, and specifically, you started to have official ballots where prior to that, the candidates and the parties had been elected by party tickets. So what's a party ticket? A party ticket was essentially, you know, people take the slates to them with the polls, sometimes even today, printed by a private group to say, hey, vote for these people. That would be like what a party ticket was then, except that people actually used them to vote, and that's how the votes were tallied. And the advantage of that system for a third party is that you can just distribute all these party tickets. The challenges are much greater when it comes to official ballot access, and then actually getting voters to look below the two major parties to the third or fourth box down the line. And so if you look at it historically, we haven't had a third party candidate elected at the federal level since, I think, 1902. And prior to that, you had, the numbers are in my book, I don't remember, but you had at least, let's say, a couple dozen members of Congress who were third party members. And it changed because that election law changed. And this gets back to a point that I was making just a minute ago, where if we want to really have an impact, you know, especially grassroots groups, we have to recognize how these rules affect where we can be effective and where we can't be effective. And so when it comes to third parties, there's a lot of reasons why that's not going to work, and I just think it would be more effective if we acknowledge that and that people adopted their strategies accordingly, because they could sure do a lot better good in other venues, shall we say. How about another question? Yes, sir.
What do you think about the convention of states movement that's going about right now?
I would like to know what they want to accomplish. I've heard presentations with a couple people in particular where they sit there and say, we're going to have this convention. It's up to you all to decide what that convention's going to do. I mean, there's this attitude like, we're going to have this convention and everyone is going to get together and sing Kumbaya, and something is going to come out of it that's going to put a check on the federal government or on whatever people are seeing as the problem. And you know, the best proposals that I've heard that might come out of it are term limits. We talked about why those would not be as effective as a lot of people think they would be. And the other proposal that I've seen would be to restore the indirect election of senators. And I spoke about why that may not be as effective as we think it would be if you still have direct primary nomination of senators. And so I think it's just more productive to drill down to the root of the problem, which is this issue of how the political parties work and how the nominating process works. And that's not to say that I think any of that's a bad idea. I mean, if you have a different thought on how effective it would be, I mean, I'd love to hear it, but I just haven't heard anything that sounds like it would move the needle in the right direction, measurably. I'm sure I offended a bunch of people with that. Yes,
So
ma'am.
did I hear you say elect delegates in the primary instead of candidates? Is that
Right.
what you said?
Yeah, that's sort of a shorthand way of saying, instead of having a candidate on the ballot, you would go through either a caucus process, or you could even have delegates, you know, like, there's different ways of doing it. You'd probably want to have delegates for like a county convention or a precinct convention on the ballot, rather than a congressional district convention. Because if you had, I mean, you're pretty familiar with how the process works, right? Yeah, so if you had a delegate for a congressional district convention directly on the ballot, which is how some states used to do it. In fact, I think that's how Texas did it for a while. Then you would wind up with a lot of the same issues that you have today, because it would take so much money, so much name ID for that delegate to get elected and become a national convention delegate. That's why I think it's important to adhere to that principle of, you know, using the precinct conventions, using the county conventions, and letting it kind of filter up that way. So, you know, when I was saying,
Versus the delegates at the national convention. Is that what you're saying?
Oh.
Instead of at the national convention, do it at the,
well, you pick the delegates for the national convention at the state convention.
that's what I'm asking.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Rather than having them directly on the ballot.
Right.
And that's actually kind of it's a little bit of an arcane area, but actually what you're asking is important, because without that grassroots level feeding into the higher levels, then the system would break down in the same way that it's broken down today. And it would be the same mess that it is. Because it would take so much money for a national convention delegate to get elected. Thank you. So it's really just a shorthand way of saying that the root of the problem is the fact that the candidates' names are on the ballot, on the primary ballot, and that's what we need to get away from. But that's not to say that primary voters aren't going to have a vote or a choice. They're just going to be choosing representatives to make the selection on their behalf, which is the way that it used to work. I mean, these are kind of nuances, but what I've found is that if the idea isn't conveyed in a very specific way, then people will say things like, well, you're just trying to take people's votes away. And that's not what it's about at all. Or they'll say, that's never going to happen. Well, it can happen. It wouldn't take a lot for it to happen, rules-wise. I mean, you're talking about a couple of lines of election code, some state party rules, some national party rules. I mean, you're probably talking about 300 words that would need to be changed, at the most. I mean, it's very little that's actually in there that covers these ideas. Another question?
Yep. So what kind of propaganda would we expect from the establishment if this started to get some traction?
Well, I think that the biggest thing is, you're trying to take people's votes away. It's undemocratic. The reality is there is a lot of entrenched interests that would not favor this move. I mean, you're talking about the media would lose its influence over essentially picking the nominee. One conversation I think that's very interesting, because I've also heard people say, well, the political donors would never let this happen. I've had a few very interesting conversations with people who give a lot of money in primary races. And what I'm about to say is almost a direct quote. I'm tired of wasting my money in these, giving money to candidates in primary races where all they're going to do is throw mud at each other, and your idea would actually save me money. And there's another aspect of this which I think is worth thinking about, which is that people that have a lot of money don't necessarily, they're not interested in all the little nitty-gritty details. So the proposition to them would really be, let the political parties sort this out, and then you just give money to the party after the nomination is sorted out, and it's a win-win for everybody. Because now you're not dumping your money down the drain. Now you're betting on a sure thing, which is really the main thing that most of those people care about. They just want to know that whoever they're backing is going to win. That's why people like Romney get all the money, because they have this assurance that he's going to be the guy that wins. He's the inevitable candidate. That's why money goes to people like Jeb Bush, because he has the last name. He's the inevitable candidate. And if the inevitable candidate was the guy that was already nominated, then that would change the dynamics quite a bit for a lot of these donors as well. So there's a couple different ways of if you talk about the party establishment, there's a whole other talk that I give to Republican clubs, which is basically along the lines of, do y'all remember what happened in 2012? What a mess it was, how Romney ended up losing in the general election after getting mud slung at him by members of his own party. And how many more times do we want to see that happen? And it has everything to do with how the process works. It's not about how great the candidates are. It's about, there's this phrase I've heard over and over. If only the candidates would just. If only the candidates would just not go negative on each other. If only the candidates would just get along. It's never going to happen under the process that we have. You can already see candidates gearing up for 2016. And even the ones that you think would be friends are getting ready to go at each other's throats. It's guaranteed to happen. We'll see the same thing that happened in 2012 happen again in 2016. That's my solemn prediction. Another question. Oh, come on. Surely I didn't answer everyone. Throw me a curveball about something else related to our system. Yes, sir.
You brought up Romney earlier.
Right.
About his campaign contributions. I thought he funded his campaign out of his back pocket.
He did a little bit, but he got a lot of money from other people. A lot of money.
He's the only candidate I've known in my lifetime that could support the campaign out of his back pocket.
And that's another aspect of why he was the inevitable candidate. I mean, people looked at that and said, well, even if this guy doesn't catch fire, even if his candidacy doesn't catch on, then he can fund it out of his own fortune. And I think that's a big reason why he got so much support. Another reason why he got so much support is because he'd already run in 2008, which, by the way, is why McCain won in 2008. It's because he'd already run in 2000. So now we're starting to see people who ran last time have this advantage. What was the other question?
About McCain, I watched carefully that election. And he got elected because he got the nomination because he started off winning in West Virginia with the help of the Democrat Party. They all went to the primary and voted for him.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
because they had crossover ability. And then the funding people said, hey, this looks like our guy, because he's taking this state and this state.
Yep.
But he would have never made it in Texas if the Texas election had been held like in February or January.
Yep.
That's another factor.
Or how about Mississippi with that recent Senate election? All the crossover voting there. I mean, you know, we're told that direct primaries are democratic. Well, they certainly work in favor of the Democratic Party, it seems. How about another?
What is your thought on Ben Carson? I mean, what you're saying a lot, I'm reading some of it's coming from him too, like y'all.
What specifically? I mean,
Just quite a few things you said tonight.
Is that right?
I mean,
I'm not. I mean, I know who he is, and I follow him a little bit, but
you haven't read books, okay?
Yeah, I haven't.
Well,
I haven't
it's
read
just
his
the
book.
changes you're talking about. It didn't take but 300 words to change the thing on the voting and all.
Oh yeah.
Just, I mean, all of that second book he's written is just so much what you're saying.
Is it the One Vote book? Is that the book?
Oh, I don't know the name. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Well, you've
It's the
given me
second one.
you've given me a homework assignment.
Okay.
I'll
I'm wrong,
check
let
it.
me know.
I'm always happy to check out new books.
The way our system was set up was it intended that some little hamlet called New Hampshire should have so much voice, and then you've got larger states who have an opportunity to voice their opinion much later in the process, don't even get a chance sometimes to vote for the candidate that they would have liked to have voted for. You know, I think there should be, and have thought so for a very long time, a national primary day. New Hampshire should not have more voice than Texas. New Hampshire should not have, because so many people begin to go downhill early on in these areas, and by the time they get to us, they're not even on the ballot.
Right. So
Because of funding.
New Hampshire and Iowa's influence is really a function of the fact that all these other states have adopted the direct primary and send their national delegates bound by the direct primary results in each state. And to even get more specific about that, so New Hampshire has always been first. Even if you go back to the decade of the 1910s.
Well, even to the point that we tried, you move up your primary and you get threatened, we're not going to accept your delegates.
Right.
I mean, this should not be allowed to happen.
Right. So the thing that's really interesting, though, is that New Hampshire, some New Hampshire state lawmaker back in 1916 or whenever it was, had this ingenious idea that New Hampshire was going to be the first presidential primary state. But back then, so few states used direct primaries to send their delegates to the national convention that New Hampshire really didn't have that much influence. It was only in 1972 and afterward when you started to have a majority of the national convention delegates already bound, before they ever went to the convention, they were bound to a particular candidate by the results of the direct primary. 1972 is when we crossed that threshold, and Iowa and New Hampshire became so much more influential than they ever were before that. My concern with a national primary is that it would only push the system further in the direction that it's already gone. So in order for a candidate to win something like a national primary, I mean, it's almost like that idea that I was referring to in my talk of abolishing the Electoral College. It would have this similar effect where now the whole result would be driven by name ID, dynastic political connections, personal fortune.
How is that different than now?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, isn't that how it's done now?
You're describing what's happening right now.
I am, but it would only push further in that direction. What we need to get back to, along the lines of a national primary, is the convention. I mean, it used to be if a national convention chose the nominee, you'd have the choice made on one day. You have representatives from all the states that are there, and everyone is on an even playing field as far as the states go. And without giving so much influence to the money and the name ID, restoring the conventions would put the states on an even
Have you been
plane.
to a national convention?
Have I been to a national convention?
Yes.
I've not personally been to one.
Quite frankly, most people are there to party.
Right. And that needs to
I've been
change.
to 5 of them.
I mean, people need
So,
to.
and so you're saying these people that are there to have a great time, you know, it should be in their hands. And you know,
Well, another thing I'm
you
saying
might
though.
want to go to a national convention and then repeat that.
Another thing that I'm saying though is that if you changed the incentives that are in the system, I mean, it's like you go to a state convention. What do we do at a state convention? We pass resolutions. The resolutions mean nothing because the candidates aren't bound to them. So here's how it used to work. You'd have a convention and they would formulate the rules, then they would pass the platform, and then on the basis of the platform, they would select a nominee. And you have a process now where most of these people are going, and yeah, it's a party because what business is that national convention really conducting? Nothing that's of any substance whatsoever. The other
No,
thing
and
about
mostly what they do is that during those prime time hours when it's going to be on TV.
Yeah, and
I mean,
they
it's-
show
it's-
up
it's
to
a-
be on TV.
It's a show.
Right. There was something else I was going to say about the whole national convention idea. I don't remember. Lost my train of thought. Let's see. I agree. I mean, and by the way, what I'm proposing and what I talk about in the book is by no means a perfect answer to any of this. It is simply a way of reckoning with the forces that govern how this process operates. I mean, national convention is by no means a perfect way to select a candidate, but it would be a lot less bad than what we have today. Because at least you get some of the money influence out of there, and you get, you know, ordinary grassroots folks selecting the nominee, voting on the nominee, and so forth. There was another thought I had about the whole thing, but maybe I'll come back to it.
As you're saying all this, I'm just thinking it's like, if you read Article 2, the president isn't very important. So, if you went back to the Constitution, this gravity that we give to the national election of the president, he doesn't have a lot of sway under our rule of law.
That's right.
We've gone way away from our Constitution and created this mess because of it.
And let's talk for a second about how that happened. I mean, when you put candidates in a position where they're going to go out to all these states and they're going to campaign, they're going to make all these promises about what they're going to do for you when they get elected, what kind of dynamic does that create? It creates a dynamic that enlarges the scope of government, almost inevitably. And when you factor in the money and all the special interest influence with that, well, now you have even more stimulus for the growth of government. And the only way to break that pattern is by changing the system. I just remembered the other thought that I had about the National Convention and the whole idea of Iowa, New Hampshire, how much influence they have. So right now under the direct primary, the way it works is whatever state has the first word or close to the first word in that process has a disproportional advantage because they're going to influence everyone that comes after them. Now, if you go back to how the convention process worked and how it would work if we started taking candidates' names off the primary ballot in at least a few states, now those states that are sending unbound delegations, even if it's just a few of them, are going to have the last word at the national convention. And you could actually end up with a brokered convention along the lines of what we hear speculated every 4 years. You know, in 2008, it was going to be a brokered convention. They were talking about that with the Democrats. These super delegates are going to, you know, ride in the night, and they're going to change the choice of the voters. That's never going to happen. And the reason why it's never going to happen is because all of the delegates for both parties go to the national convention presumptively bound to particular candidates. And the only way to get to a situation where you have a brokered convention and a truly deliberative assembly choosing the candidates is to break that link. And you'd have to have, you know, it's like I was saying during my talk about representatives and not delegates. And I don't want to get mixed up with the terminology, but the idea is that we want these people to be representatives and to deliberate in the selection of the nominee.
I'm selecting the delegates
Yeah.
at the local level, down to the county or senate jurisdiction or whatever.
Uh-huh.
How do you propose they get elected? Is that with the county chairman in the committee, or is that with the Senate congressional district? Who selects those delegates? Because as I see it, that just spreads the number of little mini demagogues out across the land, because in each little place, and we're all in the past familiar with situations where somebody has taken over a certain either a Senate or congressional
yeah.
district, and they got their own little thing, and you talk about husband and wife, they never get voted out because they're in charge.
Right.
They do the nominations, they do the vote counting.
Right. Well, I think that what we're talking about here would change, or at least the idea is that it would change the incentives in the system enough where people will go, okay, well, I want to have a role in selecting the nominee. That means I have to go out and get involved in this process that, you know, maybe I never thought about getting involved in before. And it's a very different mentality between just going and casting a vote in a primary election and going through this lengthy, I mean, if anyone's ever sat even in a county convention, it can be a little bit mind-numbing. I mean, it's a very different level of dedication and information and everything that's required of those folks than it is just to go in and cast a ballot on primary election day based on information that you got from a mailer or from a TV ad or from who knows where. But the other point that you were making about the mini demagogues is a very interesting point, because the idea here is that maybe even in your own precinct, if you want to become a delegate, you would go out and canvass likely voters in that precinct who would show up to the precinct convention and vote you to go to the next level. And I had an interesting question one time when I was describing this concept, and this guy asked me, well, what would you promise to the voters if you were going out and making this canvass? And I had to say, well, gosh, that's an interesting question. I don't think you would promise them anything in the way that candidates promise, because what you're doing is you're putting an intermediary in between the voter and the candidate, and that intermediary is not in a position to make promises and then get elected and deliver this promised result. So you would really change the dynamics of how a lot of that demagoguery works these days. I
don't have another answer. I'm just asking a question.
I mean, I'm answering it to the best of my ability and I'm sort of envisioning how it would change. But the bottom line is you would have very different incentives and the behavior would change accordingly. The behavior of voters, the behavior of party activists, and the behavior of candidates. I mean, candidates, really, if you push the scenario far enough and you just said, we're not going to have candidates on the ballot in any state, and the candidates had to be chosen at the national convention, well, now you're talking about getting back to something like the front porch campaigns that we had in the 1890s, where the candidates get informed after they've been nominated. They never even show up to the national convention the way that they do today. Does anyone know that Roosevelt in 1932 was the first candidate ever to attend the national convention where he was nominated? That practice never developed until then. And it's an interesting precedent, particularly for that president and what he went on to do, shall we say. How about another question?